All right, guys, I am back. This time I'm going to go over some writing tips. Um, as somebody who's been teaching for, gosh, about a decade now, I have graded a lot of papers, and I notice time after time after time after time, students making the exact same mistakes. So I'm going to go through this, and then hopefully you won't be the ones making the mistakes that I see all the time. Okay? So here's our funny picture of the day to get us started on the right foot. Get it? Good. Yeah, it's funny. All right. So first off, never ever use the first person in a research paper unless the assigner, the professor, the teacher, whatever, specifically says that they expect it to be written in first person. So with creative writing and stuff like that, the first person's fine. But in scientific writing, in research papers, never use the first person. Okay, that includes I, me, we, our, all those different words. Our first person, and it also goes for the second person too. So you, your, everything should be written in the first person, right? So if you want to say like, I collected data from such and such, you can either say the researcher collected data from such and such place, or even easier is to just say the research was collected from such and such a place. And that way either you use the third person or you just don't even have to be self-referential at all. Don't use contractions. Okay, contractions are when you take two words and you shove them together and make one word, right? Like don't, right? Don't is a contraction of do not. Can't is another common one. Cannot, right? When contractions aren't appropriate for formal writing, okay? Once again, if you're doing like a creative writing thing or you're writing a movie script or something, feel free. But with scientific research and formal writing, never ever use contractions. Okay. Don't be judgmental. Again, even if you're asked to argue something or to take a stance on something, there's a big difference between taking a stand on some scientific principle. Does the death penalty deter crime? Right? It's perfectly okay to take a stance on that subject and try to argue one way or the other without becoming judgmental and becoming an advocate, right? You don't have to say things like, killing people is evil and wrong. Whether you agree with that or not, that's still a judgmental advocate kind of language. You need to say, you need to speak way more neutrally, right? So the death penalty causes this, and the death penalty costs lots of money, and the death penalty does these things. So you can take a position on the issue, but don't use the language that makes you sound like you are emotionally invested in the topic. Does that make sense? This is a really tough one because a lot of us don't even realize we're using these. Colloquialisms and idioms. Essentially, these are things that are kind of unique to the English language. If you directly translated these into another language, somebody who didn't speak English would have no idea what you're talking about. So for instance, I've been reliably informed that in South Korea, there's a common phrase where older people will go up to, people in their early 20s and say, "When am I going to eat your noodles?" Okay? Now, to an English speaker, that makes no sense. When am I going to eat your noodles? Like, do you want me to serve you dinner or something? But it's an idiom in the South Korean language that essentially translates to, when are you going to get married? Okay? And again, English is full of these, right? I've listed a few of them there. To be blue, right? An English speaker would know that if you say, "Oh, I'm feeling blue," that means you're feeling sad. But if you translated that into, Russian, they're not going to understand that. How can you feel like a color? Like, do you feel orange sometimes? Do you feel purple sometimes? No. So when you say, I'm feeling blue, only other English speakers are going to get that. So we don't want to use those kind of idioms and colloquial, informal language in a formal research paper. Okay, another one, to go nuts, right? Again, English speakers will know that that means like to go wild, to go crazy, to be strange and weird, right? But that's an informal kind of phrase that does not belong in formal writing. Similarly, colloquialisms are things that are like slang, okay? It's depressing how many times I get students using slang words like gonna instead of going to in their papers. That's not. I'm a big fan of slang language. I understand that language evolves over time, and in 30 or 40 years or 100 years, gonna might be an acceptable formal substitute for going to. But for now, it isn't. And as such, I have to grade like it isn't. So I'm going to count off if I see a student use a phrase like that or a word like that. Similarly, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people write should of, right? Like it's written there. Should of, when people say that, what they really mean is that is a contraction between should and have, which should, and then the HA gets knocked off and replaced with an apostrophe, so it's should apostrophe VE, right? It sounds like should have, but it's should VE, should have, not should of, okay? Should of is completely meaningless. If you want to put this in a formal paper, because we can't use contractions, use should have, okay? Same goes for would have and could have and might have and all those similar things. Hyperbole. We have to be very, very careful and very, very accurate with our language in a formal writing, scientific research paper kind of scenario, okay? Hyperbole is the kind of over-the-top language, right? So one of my favorite pieces of hyperbole is the worst thing ever, right? Which in a conversational tone would make sense, but in a formal tone, is hyperbole really the worst thing ever? Like worse than murder? Like, no, that's ridiculous. So that is an inaccurate statement. Like, I understand that it's hyperbole, but hyperbole does not belong in any kind of formal writing, right? The house down the street was on fire, and there were like 1 million firefighters there. Again, in conversation, that makes sense, and you understand what the person means. But in a formal writing situation, you can't say things like that. There is no way that there were 1 million firefighters there. I doubt there are 1 million firefighters in the United States. So you have to be careful with your language and avoid this kind of hyperbole in order to be accurate. Apostrophes. Oh my gosh, these drive me nuts. Students won't use apostrophes when they're needed, and then they will use apostrophes when they're not needed, okay? Now this gets really complicated, but here's the basic rules, okay? If it's a plural word, like there are multiple people named Kevin, you don't need an apostrophe. It's just Kevin's, right? No apostrophe like I have written there. But if it's possessive, right? So it's like, that's Kevin's car. It's a car belonging to Kevin, right? Thus, it needs the apostrophe, okay? If it's both plural and possessive, and it ends in the S, you put the apostrophe on the end. So it's like multiple Kevins own this restaurant called Kevin's, right? It would be Kevins apostrophe, okay? The papers belonging to multiple students, right? So 10 students turn in their papers. And I look at that stack of paper and I say, these are students' papers, right? It's students apostrophe. It's both plural and possessive, all right? Now, the one kind of really famous or one kind of very common exception to this rule is its. Okay? You do not put an apostrophe on it if it's possessive. It apostrophe s is a contraction that always, always, always means it is. If you're talking about something belonging to it, it still doesn't get the apostrophe even though it's possessive. It's just its. Okay? So like the ship was sailing north. Its heading was blah, blah, blah. In that case, you're saying the heading belonging to it, but you don't use the apostrophe for plural words like you would in any other way. Remember, every time you see it apostrophe s, it stands for it is. All right? Now, verb tense. This is one you have to be careful of, not just within a sentence, but within an entire paper. The present tense is like, I am going, I am talking, I am recording a video. It's happening now. The past tense, which is the most common in research papers, is I recorded a video. I talked to the students. I did that, right? I was doing this. Those are all past tense, and you need to be very, very, very careful to pick one and stick with it. I would highly recommend using the past tense in most cases. There are some times when you're going to have to write the research papers in the present or future tense. But if you can, use the past tense. But the important thing is, no matter what tense you pick for your paper, stick with it. Don't change. Make sure everything in that sentence and in the paragraph and in your paper all agrees and is the right verb tense. So this is actually an example from one of my student papers where the verb tense is mixed, right? So you see the positive reinforcement of the mother praising her son's words reinforced, past tense, the aggressive behavior, and teaching, present tense, him that aggression and violence is acceptable in everyday interactions. So there's a mix of tenses just in that one sentence, okay? Mixing tenses among a paper is bad enough, but mixing verb tenses like that in one sentence drive teachers wild, okay? Run-on sentences. This is where you try to take two different sentences and put them into one really long sentence. Okay, so if we read this, the families of coal miners as a whole wish to continue on their tradition and be coal miners just like their parents were. So the population in Boone County is not transient. There is, however, a high unemployment rate amongst most of the whites, but the unemployment rate in Boone County is only 5.9%, blah, 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 blah. This is from a paper some of my students wrote about the documentary The Wild and Wonderful Whites of West Virginia, which is a great documentary about this family in West Virginia called the Whites. But it's a run-on sentence, right? It should be at least two, if not three, right? The families of coal miners as a whole wish to continue on their tradition and be coal miners just like their parents were, period. That's one sentence. The population in Boone County is not transient. Boom. Second sentence. There is, however, a high unemployment rate amongst blah, 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 blah. That can be a third sentence, right? So this is at least two, if not three sentences all shoved together into one really long sentence, and it just doesn't make sense, okay? I'm going to go ahead and cut this lecture in half, so I'll see you for the second half of this lecture when you choose to click on it.